I really like 007 First Light. IO Interactive, the developers, many prior to this game's announcement thought would be the perfect stewards for a Bond game, have whipped up an absolute zinger. It's intense and action-packed, it's cinematically gorgeous, everything you do has a fabulous sense of occasion, and that translates pretty reliably to fun. But I'm not going to fall down the well of saying this is a perfect game. It's brilliant in many ways, but it has some pretty obvious flaws too. Its relationship with IO Interactive's success story Hitman, for instance. It's absolutely its own thing, but in some ways it could have benefited from borrowing some stuff. It may have avoided being Hitman, albeit with hair and quite possibly an STD, but what it is isn't exactly perfect. What is? There is a lot to love in 007 First Light. There's also plenty of room for improvement. But is the game overall good? Is it worth your time? That is no doubt what you've come here to find out. Or you just enjoy hearing me waffle about games, which is perfectly valid. Either way, let's jump on in. Before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge that I did receive a code. While I'd like to think that won't skew me, there's no legitimate way of telling. As such, I'd like you to take that into consideration. These are the words of a very privileged man who didn't pay a penny to play this game. And while I'll do my best, you shouldn't hinge exclusively on my word to come to any kind of conclusion. All I can do is be honest with you and give you my perspective on it. And overall, I think IO Interactive have done a bang-up job. So, what is the premise of 007 First Light? Well, obviously, it's a James Bond game. It's a franchise that needs no introduction. It's existed for 73 years. Originally created by Ian Fleming, who wrote many books, and those many books were adapted into many movies. To simplify things, that's been going on for a good 60 years plus. I don't know why I'm doing it this way, everyone knows who James Bond is. But that highly successful franchise of novels and movies has spilled into the games industry, and there are multiple dozen Bond games. Most of them are shit. There's no surprise that across the rise of video games as a medium of entertainment in its own right, there have been many successful franchises, particularly in the realm of film, cashing in on gaming as promotional transmedia by licensing the production of hastily, cheaply made games. I won't pretend I don't miss the days when that was viable. The biggest offending franchises did this so much that every once in a while they'd accidentally release something actually good. There are over 100 Star Wars games. Most of them aren't worth your time. There are quite a few that are, though. Prior to 007 First Light, there were 31 officially licensed James Bond games, and that's not including double digits in cancelled projects, including TT Games pitching a Lego James Bond. I can understand why that fell through. Anyway, to get back to the point, the slurry of Bond games abruptly ended with 007 Legends, an experience apparently so bad it was wiped off the face of the earth, and Activision let their license expire. Since then, there have been no Bond games barring a mobile game, and the landscape of gaming has transformed drastically, with the last console release being 2 generations ago. I think it's fair to say, if the brand was ever going to return to the gaming sphere and garner any traction worthy of it, it would need to be a wholehearted, earnest, big-budget title. Furthermore, it couldn't be a bad rehash of a film. With an uncanny low-poly approximation of Daniel Craig's face, it would need to stand on its own 2 feet, and add some value to the franchise. IO Interactive respectfully took a risk here, because this is not an ordinary Bond story. He's yet to truly become the suave spy. I would be the first to argue we don't need an origin story for bloody everything, but this isn't trying to slot into any version of Bond that existed prior to the game. The flaws, therefore, of swiveling around and telling an origin story just don't necessarily exist. We just have a reason for why the character isn't quite the character you might be familiar with. At the start of the game at least, where James Bond is simply a soldier, it is a starting point to build on. It just happens to begin with the circumstances surrounding Bond finding himself on MI6's radar, allowing us to explore his core character traits. The similarities to the Bond we know are fairly obvious. He's a charismatic individual even under pressure, his greatest skill is his ability to improvise, and he possesses a fierce independence. The first mission does a great job at demonstrating this. Against an unnamed MI6 handler's orders, he undertakes a high-risk rescue operation, after becoming hypothermic and being exposed to a nerve agent. You get the point, the guy's tough. He's also somewhat unpredictable, which no doubt makes him both as frustrating as a subordinate as he is baffling to an enemy. I don't want to linger on the details of the story too much, nor do I really wish to spoil any late game stuff, but this is the character the story is going to mould into the spy we know. After this prologue, we meet Bond sometime later, where he finds himself being recruited by MI6 to undergo training to become a spy. I do find it really weird that they refer to spies in-house as spies. You'd have thought they'd have a funny name for it to soften the blow, but that's irrelevant. Bond is shipped out to Malta to join the recently restarted 00 program, where his trainer, John Greenway, makes apparent he doesn't like him.
And you're late.
We just got here by plane, what do you want me to do? Hijack the thing? It's here where Bond meets the 6 other recruits who've been training for this for some time, and James only has 2 weeks to be brought up to speed, after it's clearly demonstrated that he's woefully outmatched, and by that I mean the combat mechanics are deliberately locked up so you have no choice but to get twatted. The whole point, of course, is this is the journey. After some training and some rather blatant product placement you would expect from anything James Bond, blended into a mixture of training montages and more long-winded story moments, we're pretty much good to go and get up to vaguely spy stuff. So, how does the game play? Well, I think a good starting point to work our way back from is the desired effect it achieves is fluidity. But I'd argue that's at least partially the result of heavy compartmentalization. Hitman, from a narrative point of view, was very straightforward. The story was entirely told in between the missions. This means actual mission structure was very loose. Typically, it was a black box. You had the objective and needed to use the environment to find a means to achieve it, of which there were multiple. 007 First Light is a narrative interwoven with gameplay, so, understandably, it's a lot more rigid. Missions are a series of objectives you follow to completion. This allows the game to dice up how it plays into neatly organised chunks, meaning every facet of it doesn't need to be available all the time. Rather, the gameplay is always broken down into a series of phases dictated by the narrative alone. The Carpathian Hotel mission outlines the phases of gameplay best, and that's probably why it was utilised in marketing material. First, we have the investigation phase. This is where we soak in the environment's atmosphere, and 007 First Light is really good at establishing atmosphere. There is a prelude driving segment arriving at the place that I did skip over, and driving is most certainly a phase of gameplay, but I don't have a lot to say about it here. For the most part, it feeds into atmosphere, but the feeling you want to gather from a spy experience is being in the mix. And that's what the investigation phase is all about, weaving through this environment, overhearing conversations, using cunning and quick wit to gather information. Primarily, this aspect of the game is about observation. It may dress itself up in a way that's familiar to anyone who's played 5 minutes of Hitman, but nothing will inherently change what you need to do to progress. Your objective is your objective, and to a point you do have to partially figure it out, but once you do, you're still hitting the same notes. There's plenty of optional accenting to highlight the environment, and that extensive detail is nothing short of excellent. But replay any mission in this game and this part will go so much quicker the second time. Unlike Hitman, the path forward is the path forward, and your ability to influence it is far more limited, and that is perfectly fine. This game shouldn't be trying to be Hitman. So I find it a tad weird that it sometimes casts the illusion of trying to be Hitman. A great example is the mission prior to the Carpathian in the nightclub, where for some reason Chase and Status are doing a D&B set that comprises 1 track. The atmosphere here is great, and as a result, it's one of my favourite missions in the entire game despite it being very straightforward. They've taken an environment that's hard to make authentic when you have to weave a narrative around it, and they've made it genuinely loud and as overwhelming as it would be. But to get back to the point I'm making, how you carry out certain objectives can deviate somewhat, and of course it's up to you how much detail in this environment you soak in. so player choice hasn't gone entirely out the window, just enough to cast the illusion that your thinking has altered the outcome. For instance, at one point there's a VIP balcony area we need to reach. There are two ways to get there. That's to either get a stamp from Jacksepticeye of all people, and simply waltz on up past the security with the legitimacy to actually be there, or ascend some rigging and sneak in. But once you're in, the how you got there isn't important anymore. This area plays the same regardless. It isn't inherently bad, but it is a missed opportunity. I think if we were up here without the stamp and there were bouncers we'd have to avoid, it would make for a nice consequence for the path we chose, without deviating gameplay too intensely as an idea. That missing element rolls into the next gameplay choice the player has to make, and that's dealing with Pike. While trying to hack his phone data so we can impersonate him, we're accosted by a woman who's a bit too keen on Bond after Bond mistook her for the contact earlier in the mission, a situation you cannot avoid, and results in Bond obliterating her boyfriend in the toilets, and yes, I deliberately made that sound weird. Now she's getting in the way of us carrying out our objective because of that previous encounter we had no say in. In locating the contact, the player cannot get it right the first time. He's just not there. We can either play along or turn her down. Either way, the outcome is the same. Pike only sneaks into this close-by private booth, so all we need do is find a tray with some drinks on it and waltz on in. The mission immediately proceeds, as it was always going to, and we have to put up with this guy.
Only acceptable pineapple ever is on my pizza.
My brother in slime, I am going to harm you. Then once the data is downloaded, we have to find a suitable location to place Pike to keep out of our way while we're out here impersonating him. Our options are limited to a cupboard behind the bar, or a cupboard on the other side of the VIP area. So Bond poses as Pike's contact and leads him to one or the other and locks him in. It's the same animation either way. There is no reason for me to choose the option that would result in more steps and therefore more time taken. The choice of where to stash Pike doesn't matter because the same scene plays out either way, and there's no cause and effect in our actions influencing the environment that might skew our preference to one or the other. And I could think of two potential aggravating factors in the build-up to this that could have had an influence. How we made it upstairs could have altered the hypothetical security up there's tolerance of us, and sloppy initial identification of the contact landing us on this woman's radar. Where the game offers deviations, it soon rapidly homogenizes, and it wouldn't feel like such a missed opportunity if the game wasn't offering this illusion of choice, where we have decisions that we can make, but they ultimately don't influence anything. I understand there can't be long-term consequences across the mission necessarily, but there aren't short-term consequences, and that makes the environment feel relatively unreactive to us. This problem could have been resolved by either leaning further into the Hitman DNA or pulling further away from it. And it's not just that nightclub mission. This illusion crops up multiple times in multiple environments where the atmosphere is brilliant, but the replay value is hampered, particularly the second time around, because looking for an alternate means is redundant as deviations form up at the earliest convenience. That doesn't detract, however, from just how well put together these environments are, and how they immerse you into the experience of being a spy. While the details that push the story forward are limited, there are countless extra details to soak in, including peripheral conversations to be had, rendering the structure, even if you are just following a series of objectives, incredibly rich. When inside the Carpathian Hotel in Slovakia, it's interesting just how much optional detail there is, whether we're learning things we don't need to know about our mission, or overhearing background dialogue. There are notes to read, postcards to collect, areas to access simply for the love of the game. There's no denying a given environment can feel alive. If nothing else, the investigation aspect is great at that. Naturally, the gameplay does escalate to a trespassing phase, where you're now in an environment where you don't really blend in. You can fight your way through these phases, you can bluff your way through them, or you can use stealth. Generally speaking, the stealth is okay. However, a couple of lacking features makes it kinda weird. Firstly, stealth takedowns are not very stealthy.
Sorry, fellas.
I hate to be that guy, but for the love of God, please just choke them the f*** out. At worst, it's a pet peeve, but it's very jarring to be in a stealth segment where nobody's hearing the guy getting his skull cracked only 5 feet away. The stealth in this game can be serious fun. The use of gadgets alone varies it enough to become highly entertaining. I just find it strange that engaging enemies in stealth is so loud, and one of the big ways in which this is noticeable is the lack of takedown animations you'd rationally be able to believe you'd remain in stealth after carrying out. A big thud followed by a pained scream really doesn't fit that bill. Detection as a result feels unnaturally forgiving. Of course, that isn't necessarily the case, but you can't help but feel that way when your takedowns make a hell of a lot of noise. And that brings me to the next weird thing. You can't hide the bodies. Whenever you take somebody out, they have to stay where they fall. This means they'll inevitably be spotted and disrupt the other enemy's routines. And that is sometimes handy. Other times, when thinning the ranks while remaining undetected, you can really do without it. And that's where the ability to hide bodies, or at least move them to somewhere more convenient, perhaps could have been useful. But you'd be right in pointing out that's a problem that arises from a narrow perspective of what the stealth can be. There's more to it than merely pummeling people to sleep. You're given a series of tools to aid you in remaining undetected. The gadgets you carry on you have some sway over the selection of. You can only take so many into the field. This is done from QLab, and I suppose it means you can never bring the entire arsenal. What annoys me about this is there's no narrative context for why James Bond wouldn't take the lot, but of course the reason is controller mapping. There are only so many functions you can map, so you have to choose wisely. I respect that bit. One of my favourite tools to deploy was the smoke pod. It's a tool I deployed so frequently I actually kind of rinsed it. The Q-Watch is the constant. It allows you to hack stuff, as the one gadget you can't be without. It functions as a source of abstract chaos, the application of which is dependent entirely on what's available in the environment. You can use it to hack a printer and send paper flying everywhere, creating a distraction, or you can use it to dollop a dangling health and safety hazard directly onto somebody's head. Non-lethally, of course. He'll be fine. The laser strap also has a couple of applications, the first of which is to momentarily blind an enemy to make an impossible stealth scenario suddenly possible, and the other is to do damage to particular objects in the environment, which again can either create a distraction, do damage in its own right, or disable a CCTV camera permanently, whereas the Q-Watch can only momentarily deactivate one. The dart phone can make people momentarily unwell, forcing them to abandon their posts. It serves a nice function. Then there's the shockwave camera. Imagine a camera flash, give it steroids. I never took this one into the field. I would have, just not at the expense of gadgets that are more useful. Another bit of kit I quite enjoyed the use of is the missile pen. It's a pen that fires missiles. It unlocks later on in the game and it's great for transitioning from stealth into combat with some shock and awe. It's also handy when you see a heavily armoured guy rapidly approaching your location and you really just can't be arsed. I think there's another gadget, but I completely forgot about it. I don't think it would change my view on them. The game avoids the player becoming too reliant on the Q-Watch and the gadgets by them having a charge. That means you need to find resources in order to use them. To find the resources necessary, you need to pay attention to the environment. And in the event that you can't find anything to charge your gadgets, you're not just going to use them for everything. If there's an alternative solution, often you're going to want to consider it. I really like that the tech isn't enough to see you through. You also have to rely on more human traits. Take for instance Bond's ability to bullshit his way through things. With certain enemy archetypes, if you're caught trespassing, you can bluff your way out of it. This has to be one of my favourite aspects to the stealth. This gives you a grace period where you're suddenly accepted in an area because you've acted like you belong. It doesn't work on all enemies, but it's a great example of stealth not always meaning being invisible. The dialogue exchanges here can also be rather amusing.
Oi! What the bloody hell are
Building
you doing in
inspector.
our room?
Just checking for asbestos.
I see.
So that's why you kicked in our door from our inaccessible balcony.
You can't play as James Bond without being able to deploy the gift of the gab. He's a confident, trained spy. You'd expect him to have an answer for everything. The bluff mechanic is a clever way to put that into gameplay terms in the event you're spotted by a grunt. And you don't have to use it as a bypass to action either. you can use it to catch somebody off guard, preventing the alarm being raised or your presence becoming more widely known, or simply ensuring we'll have one less enemy to possibly deal with later. That application exactly might not be intentional, but it is useful. As for the environment, throwables is something I felt was missing in stealth. You'd think the presence of throwables would mean you can lob them in a direction where you aren't to cause a distraction to sneak past a crowd of guards. Wrong. No matter what situation you're in, there's only one thing you can do with throwables, and that's lob them at the nearest enemy's head. When you've got the hang of using environmental throwables in the middle of combat, this is awesome. In stealth, however, why can't there be a contextual adjustment to preserve the state of gameplay we're presently in? It can be applied in stealth, but you're limited to blitz attacking whomever you threw the brick at. It's not something I'm seriously hung up on, but there are a handful of times where such a feature would have been useful, so if IO Interactive is to do a sequel, and I'm led to believe they will, it's something I would like to see included, alongside perhaps being able to move bodies, and perhaps some, however limited, environmental reactivity, depending on what approach you take. Otherwise, I think the stealth in this game works really well. It's just peculiar that features you'd think would amount to common sense to somebody who finds himself in these stealth situations all the time are absent. That being said, the stealth flaws can be forgiven further when you realise that this isn't really a stealth game. You can try to play it that way, but clinging to it for the entire playthrough will inevitably be frustrating. In the natural escalation of the gameplay, detection can result in combat. For now, let's solely focus on hand-to-hand. Fundamentally, it's a system of parries, dodges, and punches, where you batter your opponent until you get a glaring HUD cue telling you a takedown is available. Takedown animations here are lacking in variety. That said, 007 First Light's combat is insanely fun. Early in my playthrough, I shan't lie, I found the brawling to be somewhat fiddly. There are certain buttons that occupy two functions, and if both functions happen to be available to you at the same time, it can feel a bit like a lucky dip as to which one you're going to get. But the general gist of it is the foundation of any combat system. You're trying to hit people and you're trying not to get hit. Defensively, you have two HUD cues. Yellow means an attack can be parried, and red means an attack has to be dodged. Parries are straightforward, as you just block, but red typically means you're being grabbed. Avoiding being grabbed is a button combined with a directional movement. Once you're familiar and comfortable with switching between the two, the hand-to-hand combat poses very little challenge in any way that isn't logistics. In the event you're overwhelmed, the odds are not going to be in your favour as you're being rushed by multiple people at the same time. You can overcome it if you can keep your head on for that long, but the hand-to-hand isn't necessarily about 1v10 scenarios. For the most part, it's a system designed to complement another facet of gameplay, be it stealth or shooting. If you're detected and decide to fight your way out, unlike a lot of games, the entire area is not immediately alerted to your presence. You just have the responsibility now to contain the situation. Doing so quickly enough without the fight spilling into the eye shot of other enemies, you're golden, and you can revert straight back to skulking around. But this isn't necessarily done to discourage you from brawling your way through. The brawls may be straightforward and animation variety might not be the most expansive, but the environment itself adds an entire tactical layer. It's not just punch, dodge, parry. You can incorporate surfaces like walls and counters, electronic devices to give your foes a shock, ledges, balconies, and drops to quickly take your opponent out of the fight.
Thanks for the warm-up, Omar.
Omar, when you are done bleeding, take the rest of the day off.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, buddy, but I reckon Omar's retired. And then, of course, the throwables, provided you can actually activate using them, rather than just grabbing the enemy that's right in front of you, because it's the same button, are great for both staggering and inflicting damage, ideal for more grabby opponents. Typically because, to reduce the risk of getting grabbed, you'll want to break their stronger defense by grabbing them first then throwing them, giving the throwable priority given the button it shares with grab. It's a great way to take the intensity out of the fight. The few hand-to-hand boss fights this game has practically rely on having plenty of these things about. Then of course in combat, if you're quick, you can deploy gadgets here. These can momentarily incapacitate certain enemies, so you can either get a cheap takedown out of them, or more time to focus on their buddies, and it would have been so easy for the gadgets to be entirely useless after being detected. But no, they pretty much still work just as well as they do in stealth. So aside from animation variety getting a bit same, particularly when brawls are kept simple, I would say the act of punching people in the mouth repeatedly is about as satisfying as punching people in the mouth repeatedly should be. Sometimes it's even more satisfying. If you're going to find yourself in a punch-up as often as this, the main thing you want from a system is one that has the basics down and works properly. 007 First Light doesn't just do that, it creates something genuinely fun. And mastery requires mastering the environment, which pretty much explains why every boss fight, if you even want to call them that, I'm not sure why there's a health bar in a Bond game, incorporates such a heavy usage of the environment. That's not to say that the boss fights within themselves are particularly memorable as boss fights go. Anyway, the hand-to-hand is one thing, but naturally the gameplay escalates further with the license to kill phase. Usually this occurs as part of a set piece, and what the license to kill phase is you're allowed to use firearms. The game becomes a third-person shooter, and your objective is to shoot people to death and avoid being shot to death. Obviously, however, we can still deploy hand-to-hand here. In fact, we'll have to almost certainly, as Bond can only carry a maximum of 1 reload's worth of ammo. There's a load of destructible aspects to the environment, and you'd hope so, but my favourite feature here is that when you're out of ammo, you're able to ping a gun at somebody's head, allowing you to move in for a swift takedown and take theirs. It's a cool on-the-fly idea for getting 1 extra projectile out of your gun in the gun itself, and it's precisely the kind of improvisation you would expect from James Bond. As for how the general shooting feels, it's fine. I can't really give it a positive nor negative. The shooting aspect within itself works. It's weighty, it's satisfying, the reticle communicates kills to you. If you've played one game like that, you've played them all. The distinction this game makes is in encouraging aggression. The ammunition you can carry on your person at any given moment is finite. If you cling to cover too long, taking pot shots, you're eventually going to find yourself pinned down out of ammo. To top it off, a lot of the cover present in these shootouts is destructible. It can only take so much damage before it disappears. 007 First Light wants you to keep moving. It also wants you to not rely exclusively on shooting at your enemies. It wants you to incorporate the use of gadgets and melee. To really make the most out of these high-octane segments, you need to be familiar with all aspects of combat gameplay. It wants you to be mindful of your surroundings and use that to be bold. It isn't striving to enable the fantasy of an idiot with a gun. We're meant to be an unflappable operative who's in control no matter how insane the situation gets. So it's not about clinging to cover and waiting for opportunities, it's about grabbing the situation by the balls and getting stuck in, utilising whatever you have at your disposal to keep pushing forwards. Using all the systems available to the full extent takes a while to get the hang of, but it is designed to be gratifying pretty early, especially considering you can't just opt for blasting in every situation, which brings me to something I can actually criticise. There are segments that begin as stealth where license to kill can be activated, but the act of being detected isn't enough to activate it. Firstly, upon detection, you find yourself brawling. The requirement for license to kill to be activated is somebody pulling a gun on you. This means, while license to kill mode is theoretically available, you can't rely on it activating when you need it. As such, Bond will not be able to use his weapons. It also means you could already be on death's door by the time license to kill becomes available, and you can actually start firing back. I get what the restrictions on this phase are trying to communicate. Bond is a 00 agent. He has a license to kill, but only when it's necessary. Unnecessary kills are only allowed when they're abstract, I suppose, but the restriction it places on instances where license to kill is not activated by default but can be, is that in order to activate it you need to place yourself at quite a disadvantage. Furthermore, these particular parts of the mission structure typically occur only moments before it's activated in no uncertain terms anyway. So I'd prefer, if killing was a potential approach, to know that before I'm in the process of being killed. What I'm saying is I wish we had some more control over the instigation. To move on, let's discuss the set pieces. This, I believe, is where the game truly comes to life. The set pieces are intense, action-packed, and throw curveballs in the gameplay left, right, and centre. The training montage at the beginning, for instance, is a great way to condense months of intense conditioning into an interactive experience. A lot of games would just skip to an evaluation where the protagonist has learned the skills off screen and must now demonstrate them. Instead, we really get a nice looking montage with well-timed transitions, aesthetic variety and just enough repetition to embed the notion of authenticity. But this is just one of the many set pieces that truly elevate the experience. You could be brawling on the wings of a plane as it takes off. You could be controlling the sway of the plane while shooting your way through it. You could be calling for Greenway to shoot enemies while you wait comfortably behind cover, or running at breakneck pace through a quarry full of paramilitary goons. You could even be using a big ball to destroy otherwise indestructible grabby robots as they chase you with malice because somebody ran out of good ideas for interesting enemy archetypes to throw into the back end of the game and instead opted for cortisol spiking robot chases. They're fairly easy to deal with once you calm down and get over the adrenaline spike that comes from being chased by an aggressive, indestructible, lifeless machine. But why does every game insist on doing my nonsensical array of irrational fears dirty like this? Who cares? It doesn't outstay its welcome. It's actually kind of cathartic to destroy the big droids. Nothing beats driving one of these big truck thingies. I don't know what they're called. Hang on. What are the big truck thingies called at building sites? Dump truck. No, that's not right. It can't be a dump truck. That sounds weird. Dump truck. Oh, it is a dump truck. Right. Nothing beats driving a dump truck. We are truly tapping into the obscure autism. Then there's the segment avoiding trip mines, exposing that Bond doesn't know how to lay on his stomach or simply step over the knee-height lasers. That one's not really a set piece though. Just thought I'd mention it here because I find it funny when games throw you up against scenarios where your ability to pass an area confines you to within the reaches of a moment's worth of logic. Rushing a sniper across the London rooftops after being attacked in your own flat, culminating in operating a crane is also cool. I couldn't hope to encompass every single way in which this game keeps its gameplay loop fresh, but I guess this is as good a time as any to discuss the driving since it happens to be a part of the set pieces. The driving is a bit notchy, the steering is limited, but usually driving is for chases or for simply leisurely arriving somewhere, so needing tight turning is very uncommon. It's odd that there are moments of tight steering in the training montage where the tightest steering after this point is probably parking up at the Carpathian Hotel. Yeah, were this driving in an open world game, it probably wouldn't pass the test, but the fact is, it's not. There are also a couple of instances where you drive boats. That's really cool. Anyway, beyond getting from A to B, the driving's purpose is product placement, particularly for Jaguars you can buy, albeit only what's left of them, from a second-hand dealer in Bradford, Land Rovers you can buy if you happen to need a tank to pick the kids up from preschool, Range Rovers for if you live in London and want your car stolen. Then there are the iconic Aston Martins, ubiquitous with James Bond, that you probably can't afford, and the Aston Martins that you definitely can't afford. But nothing made me chuckle quite like seeing a Jaguar nobody can buy. Why is there one of these relaunch EV Jag concept cars in this colour in particular sat in a ship graveyard? It's hideous! Even the lighting barely wants anything to do with it. Its presence as unapologetic product placement, if not obvious enough already, is made even more obvious by the dialogue of Matey Boy over here flexing it, like pulling up to the family function in one of these abominations wouldn't instigate a diplomatic incident. It's apt that it's called the Jaguar Type 00, because 0 just so happens to be the sum of friends you'd have if you owned one. There is truly no limit to my hatred for this glorified microwave. Furthermore, what is it doing in a pirate haven built out of a ship graveyard in Mauritania? This product placement is so out of place, I genuinely have no choice but to believe IO Interactive deliberately made it as outrageous as possible. But to get back to the point, as you can tell, driving is fine. More product placement! The driving gets the job done more than anything, and that's all it needs to accomplish, especially when If you can't be bothered with a couple of the few driving segments, the game will drive for you. As for the likes of QuickTime events, they're okay, they're not fiddly and they're forgiving. I really respect that the game wants the player engaged with the cutscenes, so there's QuickTime combat, QuickTime injecting yourself with substances, QuickTime tying a bow tie, that one's actually pretty cool, QuickTime womanizing? Thankfully not. There are scenes where you have dialogue options, choose wrong and you might die. You have to both time your dialogue and say the right things. Sometimes you're just influencing the order of the conversations, but other times there are consequences for ballsing it up. I like that, and I'd like it more if every time I failed the mission on these, it didn't mean I'd have to experience the same conversation 4 times as I trial and error my way to success. What about other content? Well, there's the tax sim, and I'll be honest with you, in its current state I don't really much care for it. I'm sure there are plans to implement tons of content through it in the future in line with the likes of the live service they've offered for Hitman for years, which might transform how it is in the future along with hopefully my view of it, but I found its initial selection of simulations to be somewhat lackluster. It's a series of challenges with increasingly strange limitations, and it doesn't really feel particularly satisfying to play much of them. While I understand its purpose, it just doesn't have anything in it yet that I'd say is worth my time, and that's a shame. I hope this is a problem exclusive to the short term though, but I can't judge something based on what it might become. I can only judge what's there. In that, the tax sim is not especially impressive, but hopefully with a few months of updates it might be the best part of the game, who knows. So, overall, the gameplay is a fun time in my opinion. It hits all the marks it needs in order to feel like a comprehensive Bond experience, from investigating to sneaking to slapping and killing. The set pieces and linear storytelling allow for curveballs. Some are fun and some are a tad inconvenient. The main thing is, across a playthrough, at no point did I feel as if there was no chance for something new to be introduced, even if only briefly before the end. And that speaks to a well-timed length for the kind of game it's trying to be, just as much as it confirms the game is enjoyable. However, there are missing aspects this game feels like it could have benefited from, and if you go into this game sold on the idea that you can influence your approach, you're going to be disappointed. That being said, if you aren't committed to playing the game a particular way, and are open to rolling with it however it goes, then you're in for a blast. To move off of gameplay, let's talk about some of the other stuff. The narrative is decent. I really don't want to elaborate, but it's a nice introduction to this Bond. An origin story was an interesting choice. I think the less experienced Bond covers some of the game's flaws fairly nicely. Bond's odd stealth deficiencies are the result of a lack of experience. Bond not hiding extra ammo up his backside, we'll chalk it down to amateur behaviour. It's the right story to tell when finding your footing adapting an IP that already exists. As for Patrick Gibson's portrayal, that's also solid. He's not quite the elegant spy nor the smooth operator he's to become just yet. He's still learning his trade across the plot, which allows for his character to be explored with less refine and plenty of input from other characters. I don't like that he likes the Jaguar Type 0 friends though.
Oh, would you look at that? My kind of trouble.
But we'll chalk that down to the many head injuries he sustains. That being said, he's full of wisecracks and his quick wit is on full display. The main downside of this being an early days story, however, is we're yet to see Gibson actually portray Bond as we know him. What I'm getting at is at no point in this story is he the complete article. For that pleasure, we'll have to await a sequel, and I look forward to it. There's definitely promise here. But Bond isn't the only character worth the time. M is M. I like Bond's passing aloof interactions with Ponsonby, and Greenway is an ideal training instructor because he's a natural foil to a young Bond's reckless, less mature demeanour. He's the experienced operative. What Bond's dipping his toes into for the first time, he's done 100 times before. The duo's relationship is somewhat standoffish. It's a begrudging mentor and belligerent apprentice dynamic, giving their relationship room for growth over the narrative. As for Baines-Non's fellow recruits, most of them have no character to write home about aside from Cressida and Monroe. with whom we're made to feel Bond's camaraderie, which makes the events that transform him into the more solo agent all the more impactful. Q is likeable from the off, which is to be expected. He's kind of the guy who's always in Bond's corner. He's also the guy that gives us all the cool stuff. It's kind of hard not to like him. As for Moneypenny, she occupies the role of a no-nonsense handler, so she has a helpful function, and any cracks made in the no-nonsense exterior feels well earned. As for the villains, well, Bond villains are a very particular type. Typically, they're wealthy, eccentric egomaniacs, introducing the man with the golden face. I think divulging too much about the villains is something of a spoiler. After all, it's meant to be a spy thriller where nothing is as it seems, yet I think the plot can be a touch predictable with who's who in this respect right up to the final twists. Nevertheless, if I do a video at a later date re-exploring this game long after the dust has settled, I'm sure I'll dive into the plot in more depth, but it's clear what the commentary overall is on. It's contemporary and applies pretty nicely to a commonly perceived societal blind spot of the present age. Overall, I really enjoyed this story, but I haven't had the time to properly digest it or replay it end to end. Anyway, on the topic of music, it's got some bangers. I enjoyed the nightclub, the opening title sequence, the music choice during the action sequences. All of it helped bring the atmosphere together to make it a really fun time. I believe it's impossible to overestimate the value of good music. In bringing an experience together, it practically dictates the tone. Performance-wise, I played on a bog-standard PS5, so I was fully willing to accept 30 FPS mediocrity, but it's silky smooth and reasonably unproblematic beyond that. I seldom noted any bugs, though there were occasional ones, but that's to be expected from even the most refined games, so I'll let them slide. So to bring this video to its much anticipated yet long overdue conclusion, do I recommend 007 First Light? Yes. That being said, I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's an excellent foundation for more Bond games from IO Interactive. I would particularly like to see more cause and effect in choosing approaches in a prospective future release, as environmental reactivity did feel like it was lacking here, when it maybe should have been a more defining aspect of the mission structure, and that's probably my biggest criticism overall. It's a robust attempt by IO Interactive, bearing in mind this game is neither Hitman nor desiring to be it, which is absolutely the right approach. There just were times where I found myself missing certain aspects of Hitman that could have been implemented to the benefit of this game. That's really what I'd hinge my recommendation on. If you're looking for Hitman, play that. But if you're looking for a good action-adventure game that doesn't outstay its welcome, borrows some Hitman DNA and has a flair of Uncharted, thrilling, fast-paced action, and an abundance of sequel potential, 007 First Light is a great choice, and I really enjoyed it. So with that said, I thank you all for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends. All that wonderful stuff, of course, if you want to, would be massively appreciated. And if you fancy joining our cozy Discord server, feel free to do so via the QR code on screen now. If you can put up with my rambling for any length of time, you're more than welcome. Either way, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, please take care and goodbye.